her title as First Lady is probably not even great enough. I think that she really belongs in American history as one of the great leaders in American history and among the great pantheon of reformers like Jane Addams and Mary Church Terrell. Brookdale Farm was sort of a village unto itself. If you look at this photo of the air, from above, it housed not only the Thompson family, but all the staff lived on the grounds. All the racehorses and everybody involved in the horse racing operations, as well as the farm and all the people who farmed and livestock as well. So that Brookdale Farm always was sort of its own little feudal manor, in a sense, for the first half of the century. I'm actually going to go forward a little bit. So the name of my project is Mrs. Thompson Saves the Day. And it's a working title, maybe it'll change. I always think, well, maybe I'll change it, but I don't think I am. I keep coming back to it because it really suits her, and it really suits her story so well. Mrs. Thompson saves the day because it appears throughout her life she was always stepping in to save her children, save people in her family, and to save the people in New Jersey. And so throughout the book, I keep picking up this theme of her saving the day. And this photograph is actually a recent photograph that I've been given by one of her great-grandchildren. I have been fortunate enough to be able to be in touch with several of her great-grandchildren. None of her grandchildren are around anymore, but her great-grandchildren have been very generous in sharing some old photographs of her and the family. This is a photograph of her and her husband Lou in the Adirondacks. I noticed you have an Adirondacks t-shirt on. I couldn't help but notice the Adirondacks. They used to summer in the Adirondacks every year, and they would stay at a camp there, rented camp, and they would hike and swim and canoe, and all the children, generations of Thompsons really enjoyed the Adirondacks. One of the problems with doing a biography like this is the research process. And the research process in a biography of this nature is really difficult because her papers have not been preserved. That she's scattered, literally scattered in the papers of people all over the country. And so I have ended up in archives, getting archival material from Arthur Vanderbilt's papers and from papers in West Virginia and in Montana. You would not believe where I have been finding her. She was a letter writer, so she wrote to everyone. But none of her stuff is in one place. It's all over the place. So it has been really, really challenging. Why should I write a book about her? Well, one of the things that drove me to write about her was that she has no conclusive biography. There has been no real treatment of her life in a book. There's been a lot of articles about her that kind of sum her up in a sort of a list of accomplishments, but nothing that really delves into who was she? What made her her? What were the things that made her sad? What were the things that made her happy? What was her personal life like? So I've been trying to craft a story of not just her political accomplishments, her public work, but also the private life. And it's been a really interesting process. I look at writing biography as a little different than history, and I write on that slide, history versus biography. The personality has to drive the biography. Whereas if you write a history, it's the events, right? So the idea of being the artist under oath. I have to tell her story while being truthful to the facts, truthful to the documents, truthful to the materials. And so this idea of creating her, I'm creating her almost out of nothing because there is nothing previously written about her. She was in the newspaper hundreds of times, hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles she was in, but no real comprehensive look at her life. So this is what I've been working on for the last year and a half, and probably will be working on for quite a bit longer. One of the sources I have that's wonderful is a bunch of letters written by her daughter, Elizabeth, who they call Betty. Betty Thompson Babcock, who wrote, she was the only child who survived her. Now, Mrs. Thompson died in 1967 at the age of 95, which I was mentioning to you before. And she, three of her 4 children predeceased her. Her son Bill died in 1948, her daughter died in 1949, her other son, Louis Jr., died in 1965, and Betty is the only surviving child. When Mrs. Thompson died and the college purchased part of the land and the park system took another part of the land, they contacted Betty, and Betty wrote the family history. And it has been an enormous help to me to have this family narrative from Betty's perspective. But one of the problems is, it's from Betty's perspective, okay? So this is one of the things that, as people who are interested in history, as a local history society, that you have to you should be kind of into this, right? How do we do our work? So Betty Babcock also was an artist. She was an artist and a published author herself. She had written a children's book in the 1940s that received awards, and she drew beautiful drawings. She was a beautiful illustrator. And one of the things that she did was she drew the land, and she drew the house, and where all the bedrooms and all the floors, and she drew this magnificent drawing of the house. And so she draws this as a triangle, and many of you may be familiar with the book A Triangle of Land. Triangle of Land was written in the 1970s, a history of Brookdale and a history of the land. So in Triangle of Land, which was written by a number of co-authors in the AAUW, the American Association of University Women, and the beginning of the section on the land is this. At 74 degrees 10 minutes longitude and 40 degrees 20 minutes latitude in Monmouth County, New Jersey, lies a triangle of land. It is bordered by Route 34 on the west, Route 520 on the north. Phalanx Road forms the triangle's boundary. Within the triangle lies an open and rural expanse made fertile by Hot Brook, Big Brook, and an abundance of streams and ponds whose waters unite to form the swimming river. The river runs northwest and forms a reservoir on either side of Phalanx Road. And so we get the description, but Betty beautifully leaves us with this, her hand drawing of the triangle of land as well. She also wrote to Lee Cook, who was a reporter for the Asbury Park Press, and at the end of this long letter that she writes about her family, her father's family, her brothers and sisters, and some stories, some reminiscences about growing up at the farm, she wrote at the end, "I trust these long-winded notes will be of some use. Yours sincerely, Betty Babcock." Well, yes, Betty, they have been of enormous use to me. And so from Betty's recollections, I've been able to go from there and research from there. One of the stories Betty tells she tells it actually in several different reminiscences, is a story that I cannot verify. It's really frustrating because it's a wonderful story. Betty tells a story of being a little girl and her mother telling all the children one night a bedtime story. We're all in their mother's bed, and Mrs. Thompson is reading a story to them. When a knock came at the door, and it was Mr. Thompson's valet, who came up to Mrs. Thompson and whispered something in her ear. She dashed from the bedroom, ran down the stairs, ran down the front porch, vaulted over the balustrade on the front porch, and there stood a number of African-American stable boys, the boys who were the grooms in the horse training operation. One of the boys was bleeding profusely from his mouth. They had brought their sick friend to Mrs. Thompson. And she takes the boy and she tells the boys, "You did the right thing to bring your sick friend here. It's okay, I'll take care of him." She immediately directed the staff to get some ice and some towels. She told her son Bill, get your father, get the car, go to Red Bank, get Dr. Richards, and come back. She takes the boy and she takes him to behind the house where there's a hill, and the night air is cold. So she wants this boy to have cold night air. He's having a hemorrhage. And she holds the boy, she puts the ice on his feet, she puts the blanket on him, and she waits for the doctor to come. Dr. Richards comes in the driveway in loose Packard, spraying pea gravel everywhere. He comes to a stop. Old Dr. Richards comes with his little black medical bag, comes up to Mrs. Thompson and to the young man, and he says, Mrs. Thompson, the boy is dead. And you did everything right. You did everything you were supposed to do. There was nothing more you could do. So Betty tells this really beautiful story. And she said, I don't know how long my mother sat there holding this boy in her arms. At some point, maybe my father came and took him. And so Betty's stories are fantastic. I cannot find a Dr. Richards. Now, she told this story in 2 different interviews at 2 different times. I cannot find a Dr. Richards. I have gone crazy looking for, I want to tell the story so badly. But what do you do if you cannot verify? I cannot find in the census this young man that she describes. She only knew his nickname. She didn't know his given name. So Betty's story really presents the historian with both wonderful gifts and frustration at the same time. And so these are the kinds of things, as you do this kind of research, that you end up being faced with. In addition, I want to talk a little bit about the farm. And I've been finding out all kinds of interesting things. I'm going to share some of my discoveries and my treasures with you tonight. This slide shows the man who made Brookdale Farm, D.D. Withers, David Dunham Withers, who is here on the left, known as the Sage of Brookdale. And he's a real character. He was an extremely wealthy man, short, very short hair, trimmed mustache, born in about 1820, and he made an enormous fortune. He was very wily and good in business, and he grew up in New York and was a banker in New York, but ultimately he moved to the South and had cotton plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana. He was an enslaver. He had labor that was enslaved people and made a tremendous fortune before the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, he left and decided to get out of the United States while the war was going on, and he went to Paris. Because he didn't want to fight, he didn't want to pick sides, and he didn't want to be involved. So while he was in Paris, he's about 40 years old, 40 in his 40s, he falls in love with horse racing. And he becomes an enormous fan of horse racing and begins to study it like a scholar. He reads everything he can about raising horses, about breeding horses, everything. When the war ended, he returned to the United States and he bought 5 adjoining pieces of land that would become Brookdale Farm. So he bought 5 different farms and put them together to make an 800-acre farm. And the farmland, the land in Monmouth County is particularly good for farming and raising horses because it is been improved with marl, a greenish clay, a potash that has been sown into the soil that make it really, really fertile and really good for horses' feet. It's really good for the horse, the mud on the horse's feet. So he takes this 5 different farms and he makes it acre farm, and he calls it Brookdale. He designs all the buildings, he designs all the stables, he designs the rings, he has and supervises the construction of everything. He's very hands-on, and he has essentially taught himself how to raise horses. He begins to import horses from Europe in order to start new bloodlines. Why does he have to start new bloodlines? Well, during the Civil War, almost all the good racehorses were killed in the battlefield. So the American horse racing was really almost non-existent by the end of the Civil War. So he's bringing it back to life. He also, as a kind of a sideline here, Monmouth Park was up for sale, and he puts a group together, and they buy Monmouth Park, and he wants to make Monmouth Park like the Ascot of the United States. Ascot's a pretty horse track in England, so he wants to emulate English racing. And so you see his house there, and some of his buildings are still there at Brookdale. That's how wonderful they are. He was also quite a kind of an irascible, kind of eccentric person. He never married, he never had any kids. He was really, really rich. He had a lot of good friends. He never bet. He just wanted to win. He didn't care about betting money. He was very strict about the rules of racing, but he never bet any money. So he was considered sort of an oddball for that. He dies sort of unexpectedly of influenza in 1892. Very short illness. And it is purchased. So the estate of David Dunham Withers sells Brookdale Farm. He doesn't have any kids. His siblings are his heirs. His siblings get all his money and his farm. And they sell the farm to this man, William Payne Thompson. So this is how the Thompsons become owners of Brookdale Farm. They buy it from Withers Estate in 1893 for about $138,000, but then they have to also buy the horses, and that added about another $100,000 to the purchase price. So they spent about $250,000 buying this in 1893. I recently found a letter from William Thompson, who is on the left, on the right, William Thompson to his brother-in-law, who was also one of his business partners. And this was really exciting to me when this letter was found. It was found in West Virginia in the J.N. Camden papers in West Virginia. So William Payne Thompson writes to his brother-in-law, "Dear Camden, I have concluded the purchase of the Withers farm. It takes about $250,000, and later on I suppose more to round it up. But the more I think about it, the better I am satisfied that it was a wise and proper thing for me to do. Both my boys have got some bad physical taints. Willie especially. Louis, I think, will grow out of it. I'm uncertain about Willie, but apparently with my surroundings, the best thing I can do now is to learn them business and keep them in the open air." So there's a lot of illness in the Thompson family. These people are always sick. I've never seen a family with more sickness than the Thompsons. Lou Thompson had typhoid and tuberculosis. Willie also had tuberculosis. The daughter had tuberculosis. William Thompson's siblings died of tuberculosis. These people are in extreme crisis with their health, according to these letters. And then he writes another letter in April of 1893 that also, I think, is really fantastic. He writes, "Dear Camden, I go down to the farm every Friday now, and it is a source of great delight. For the first time in my life, I have got something that I really wanted, and that I enjoy. I am very anxious for you to see the place and to go over with you the general line of thought I have had in securing it, and now I am running it." And this is, I think, just a delightful letter. He talks a lot about how much he's so happy that he bought this farm. And it's kind of surprising to me that, it's finally got something I really wanted. William Thompson was one of the first directors of the Standard Oil Company. His office was down the hall from John D. Rockefeller Sr. He was a secretary of the Standard Oil Company, and really one of Rockefeller's henchmen, really, when you read the history. And he became a millionaire by working for Standard Oil. And it's the farm that makes him happy, right? The farm and his ability to hand it off to his sons, who are both very sickly. This is just a picture of one of the letters. This has been a real treasure hunt, right? Who would think to look in the J. N. Camden papers in University of West Virginia for stuff about Brookdale and Mrs. Thompson? It's been really a challenge. So here's Mrs. Thompson as a young woman, right? So Geraldine Thompson was born in 1872. She died in 1967. She was born to a wealthy and prominent New York family, so she's not a New Jersey person. She was born and raised in New York. She was a Livingston, so she is related to the Livingstons of the Declaration of Independence, who signed the Declaration of Independence and fought the American Revolution, and all owned homes along the Hudson River Valley, Dutchess County. She also lived in New York City, so she spent a lot of her time in New York City, and in the summer she lived in the Hudson Valley. She did not attend school. She was tutored privately at home, but she did get 2 years of a convent school in France. That was her only formal education. She has a long history in the family of reform. Her grandmother was a great reformer in New York City. She was one of the women who would travel, who would visit Blackwell's Island and write reports, and helped to found the nursing program at Bellevue Hospital after the Civil War. So she has a really long line of great reformers in her family. Her sisters were really well-known suffragists and Red Cross volunteers during World War I and members of the peace movement, peace activism. So they were all really active women. But she had tuberculosis. Geraldine Thompson, as a young woman, at some point gets tuberculosis. We don't have a lot of information about what age she was when she got sick, but she tells a newspaper reporter in 1940, for many years as a girl, well, he asks the question, right? He asks the question, why are we giving so much money to tuberculosis causes and stuff? And she says, well, for many years as a girl, I was forced to spend my time traveling. I had tuberculosis. Why did you have to travel? Well, you have to travel because you have to get to a climate that's healthy when you have tuberculosis. And so she goes to Colorado Springs, and she spends a number of years out in Colorado because it's the altitude, the dry air, was thought to be very healthy and helpful to people with tuberculosis. And in the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, there were dozens of sanatoriums there to cater to people who were sick with tuberculosis. And of course, a lot of them did not make it, but a lot of them stay. And this is how Colorado actually became populated with these people who were drawn there for the cure. While she's there, she also meets her husband. Because remember, he was sick, because everybody in his family's got it too. So she meets Louis Thompson there. Although I'm not sure exactly how this happens, there are competing stories about this. She said that she met him at a health resort. One of Betty's letters, she said his sister introduced them. So in some way they became acquainted. Why did they like each other? I think it's because of athleticism. Lou was a sportsman. He was one of the best marksmen in the country. He competed in shooting competitions, and he was a great hunter. He hunted with Teddy Roosevelt and things, so he was a really, really active outdoorsman, fishing and hunting and shooting. She was extremely athletic as well, especially for a woman of her generation. She played tennis, she swam, she jogged every day, she rode horses. She was extremely athletic, and I think that that's something that really draws them together. She also could hunt. When she went hunting with Lou on his hunting trips, she was as good a hunter as the men. So they get married in Statsburg, New York, which is their family seat in Dutchess County, in June of 1896. And I just want to read you a little letter from Lou to his uncle. So Lou's father actually died in February of 1896. So he only gets his farm for 3 years when he passes away. And none of his letters mention anything about Geraldine. So it makes me think that he never met Geraldine or knew anything about her. But a couple of months after his death, Lou wrote this letter to his uncle. So these were in the same papers. My dear uncle, as you keep posted on the important events of the day, I don't suppose you will be surprised to hear the news of my engagement to Miss Morgan of New York. Her maiden name is Morgan. Some unofficial rumors have been flying about, but this one is official from headquarters, and I am glad to say meets with a generous and hearty approval. On June 20th has been set for the day of the wedding, which will of course be a very simple and quiet affair. I am counting on you and Aunt Annie to be on hand and to give your blessing and good wishes for our future happiness. With love from us all to you and yours, affectionately your nephew, Louis S. Thompson. So I was so excited to find that because I could find evidence of and verification of this romance and this marriage. And it was really interesting. And I just think Lou sounds so happy in that note. You know, he sounds so happy to be sharing that news with his uncle. Shortly after their wedding, they moved to Brookdale Farm. And they do return regularly to Colorado. Colorado comes up in their story in a surprisingly frequent amount. I found out that their daughter Betty was born and baptized in Colorado. So they constantly are going back there. In later interviews, when she was older, she told a reporter, my husband was not much of a family man. And what does this mean? Does this mean they were unhappy? You know, what is their marriage like? Well, Lou was constantly following the geese, going to shoot geese in geese season, go salmon fishing in salmon season, go hunting in Idaho, go to the Keys to go fishing in the winter. And he bought another farm. He bought a farm in Georgia called Sunny Hill Plantation. And Sunny Hill Plantation is even bigger than Brookdale, and it's on the Florida-Georgia line, and was fantastic quail hunting. Had the biggest quail population anywhere. And it really became an area that attracted a lot of wealthy men at the turn of the century for this kind of sport. And so that's Lou on the right, sitting next to Walter Teagle, his friend, and that's the Sunny Hill Plantation. After he passed away, Geraldine sells Sunny Hill to Walter Edge, who was the governor of New Jersey twice. He was twice governor. So she sells to sort of like kind of political acquaintance. She sells Sunny Hill. So this is where Lou goes half the year. He's at Sunny Hill, she's at Brookdale. They don't live together. They don't live together very much. They're not together very often. And then I found this, which I thought was a really interesting clue to, before we go down the assumption that they hated each other or they didn't get along. I found a handbook on the prevention of tuberculosis. So Lou and Geraldine both had tuberculosis as young people, and in 1903, the charity organization in the city of New York published a book on how to prevent tuberculosis. So Dr. Loomis is one of the foremost physicians, pulmonary doctors at the time, and he was the Thompson's doctor. So when I read the letters from William Thompson talking about how everybody's sick, he's always saying, maybe we should send them to Dr. Loomis. It's Dr. Loomis, right? So Dr. Loomis writes in this article, in this book about preventing tuberculosis, that there's 3 things you've got to do to prevent tuberculosis. You've got to be in sunshine, high altitude, and dry air. And the 3 places he says are good to go are the Adirondack Mountains, Thomasville, Georgia, and Colorado Springs. Guess where they go? Thomasville, Georgia, Colorado Springs, never in good health. Lou only had one lung because of tuberculosis. And I think that they did not like, I don't think they disliked each other. I think that he is always living and staying in places where he's healthiest so that it doesn't come back. Tuberculosis can go dormant in your body, but it can become active again. And it can reactivate. And then I found this. And this was really just amazing. So I found a letter, and this is sort of one of the great pleasures of doing this difficult work. One day I went into the Miriam Van Waters papers in the Harvard website, which is all digitized, and you can just sit there and they're all scanned as PDFs. And I went in the miscellaneous file. Miscellaneous folder, right, where they don't know what any of it is. No dates, no names, they don't know what this stuff is. They just stick the stuff they don't know what it is in the miscellaneous. I said, I never looked in here, let me look in here. And I found the thing that I have been looking for months. I found a letter from Lou to Geraldine. I had millions of letters of hers written to other people, and I had letters of his that he had written, but nothing of one to the other, which was what I was craving. I was craving this, what was their relationship like? So I found, when I opened the file, I saw his handwriting immediately. I knew it was him. Very distinctive handwriting. And the letter says at the top, "Dearest honey." I said, "Dearest honey." He loves her. "Dearest honey." And then he goes on to describe his fishing trip. And he writes really nice letters, I gotta say. Lou wrote very interesting and very fun letters. And he goes on and on for 4 pages about chasing this tar pond, like very much like Hemingway in The Old Man and the Sea, chasing, this tar pond, took all his line, and he lost his fishing rod, gets pulled overboard with this big fish, and he goes on and on and on about fishing trip. And then the end. The letter closes, "You are the dearest person in all of this world to me, and I send you all of my love, always your own, Lou." So happy. I danced around my house. I was so happy. And so this was a treasure, right? It was miscellaneous. Nobody knew in the Harvard archive who Lou was. They didn't know who Honey was. I did. I knew who they were. I knew what they were talking about. So, and they actually have it dated incorrectly, I believe, in the archive as well. But it's when you get into this work and you live with these people in your head all day, every day, and you know them better than anybody. Dearest honey. So after they got married, they had 4 kids. This is one of the only portraits I have of them. Lou is standing in the back with a hat on, and the driver of the carriage is Barney Kelly, who had worked with them for years and years, and his family, his children all work at Brookdale Farm for decades, and the children there as well. And this is the renovation of Mr. Rither's house. You remember what Mr. Rither's house looked like? Lou's father does an enormous renovation on the house, and he makes it much bigger, puts in gas lighting and heating system, and he completely renovates the house. So this is the house as we know it today, right? It still kind of looks very similar. And it became the center of her work. This is her headquarters. This is where she has all her meetings, where she has fundraisers, where she organizes her social work activities. And the house was always open and very hospitable to people for all different kinds of things. You maybe were a Boy Scout and got to camp out on the grounds. There was Frogtown Frolic and a pet show, and people would come to the farm. So the farm was very much open to everyone. And so there's Mrs. Thompson on the right, running this meeting of her staff. And as the Boy Scouts, I mentioned, you know, the Boy Scouts there at one of her birthday parties, and she was one of the founders of the Monmouth County Boy Scouts in 1917, and always maintained a very strong support for them. So this is so now I just want to tell you one more story about her work. I can't tell you all the stories about everything she did in her life. She was involved with dozens of organizations on the county and state level. But this is a really important episode in her life that I want to tell you about. As you know, she had tuberculosis as a young woman. She recovered. But when she moved to Monmouth County, there were no services. There were no hospitals. There were not enough beds to take care of people, and particularly people who were poor. And in 1912, Mrs. Thompson begins probably one of the most important things, one of the most important projects that she was engaged in, and that is the founding of the Monmouth County Organization of Social Services. She got involved in it because there were people in Monmouth County who had tuberculosis and were staying home with their tuberculosis because there was nowhere for them to go. It was spreading to other members of the family, and entire families were dying of tuberculosis because they had no care. In the spring of 1912, she went to the freeholders meeting and told the story of a young African-American boy from Long Branch named Arkansas Bass. And she asks the freeholders to provide county funds to send him to a tuberculosis sanatorium. There was nowhere in the county for him to get care. She explained that he had advanced tuberculosis, that he was in a hospital here in Long Branch, but he had had an arm amputated because it had spread from his lungs to his bones, and that he was suffering, and that he did not have long to live. He was terminal. Arkansas Bass appears in the paper 2 years earlier because he had been arrested. Police had arrested him because he was, they called him an objectionable boy, that he had been on Broadway in Long Branch. He was using indecent language and bothering the merchants there, so the police arrested him and brought him to the county. And so here we are 2 years later, and he's dying. And so she explains to the Monmouth County freeholders that she had found a place for Bass to go. It would cost $9 a week. And if he was left in his home, he was likely going to spread tuberculosis to the other members of the family. It was a danger to public health. And the freeholders decide, well, we'll look into it and we'll see that if it's legal for us to allocate county funds for his care. And ultimately they decide that yes, we can provide the $9 a week, and he is taken to Trenton Hospital. And this is the article that appeared in the paper 2 weeks after that freeholders meeting. Arkansas Bass, a colored boy who underwent several operations at the hospital here to prevent the spread of tubercular trouble, was removed to the Trenton Municipal and County Hospital for tuberculosis Saturday. He was admitted through the efforts of Mrs. Lewis S. Thompson. This is the beginning of her career. 2 weeks later, she held the first meeting of the Monmouth County Charity and Aid Society at her home. She puts an ad in the paper, anybody can come. 150 people came to that meeting, representing every town in Monmouth County. Think about how few people lived in Monmouth County. And it was the beginning of MCOSS, Monmouth County Organization of Social Services, which still, to this day, serves 60,000 families a year in Monmouth County. So this was a place that had no services, no visiting nurse, not enough hospital beds, and through her efforts, by helping Arkansas Baths, she started the MCOSS in 1912, and here we are 110 years later, and it is still going on. She served as the president until 1952. She retired from the MCOSS, so she stayed their president for 40 years as their leader. And this is, I think, instrumental story for understanding her as a person. She also wanted the county, she also pressures the county and bothers and bugs and annoys
Attention library patrons, the library will be closing in 30 minutes at 9 p.m. Computers will shut down at 8:45 p.m. All information is automatically deleted when the computer shut down. Do not save information to the desktop. You must save to a USB drive or email yourself your files. Fines will no longer be accepted after 8:45, so please check out your items as soon as possible. Bathrooms will close at 8:55 p.m. If you need to call for a ride home, please go to the Children's Help Desk or the Reference Desk immediately. The library opens tomorrow at 9 a.m.
I'm almost done, I promise. Helping Arkansas Baths and starting MCOSS was not enough. She also wanted the county to open a tuberculosis hospital in Monmouth County to serve the tubercular population, people who had tuberculosis. If you had to go to a tuberculosis hospital, you had to stay there for a really long time to get better. This was a very long recuperation, which means if you're in Glen Gardner, which is where the state hospital was, you're not going to see your family or your friends for months. She understood how isolation was so difficult for these people who were trying to get better. So she bugged them and bothered them and pestered them to open a hospital facility for tuberculosis in Monmouth County. They told Mrs. Thompson, the freeholders told Mrs. Thompson, get enough signatures on a petition and we'll see. You know, you gotta show us that enough people want this. So 4 years later, she came into a freeholders meeting in 1916, 4 years after Arkansas Baths, and she dropped on the table great bundles of paper. And she had gotten 12,000 signatures of people who believed that a tuberculosis hospital in Monmouth County was necessary. That represented half the voters. She got their support. And there it is. It's built and opens in 1921. So it takes yet another 4 years after that before the hospital is open. What does this say about her? Nothing is futile, she said. She was interviewed. She said, nothing is futile. Never give up. Never give up. Even if a project gets results once out of every 5 times or once out of every 10 times, that is something to be thankful for. At least that much has been accomplished. She was persistent, she was courageous, and she believed in what she was doing. And she would never be discouraged, even if she lost. And she lost many battles in this long career of hers. She didn't always win, but she never gave up. One of the sad things about tuberculosis and Mrs. Thompson isn't just her own bout with it, her husband's bout with it, Arkansas Bass's bout with it, but her daughter. Her daughter, also named Geraldine, but was called Puss. Her name was Puss. Puss Thompson she got tuberculosis in the 1920s when she was a frontier midwife. She went to midwifery school and was a frontier midwife in Kentucky, in the Appalachians. And she came back from doing that and she had tuberculosis. She suffered for 20 years, and eventually she was terminal and she died in 1949 of tuberculosis. So what must have that been like for Mrs. Thompson? She's doing all this work for tuberculosis, education and care and helping people. She can't help her own daughter. She takes her everywhere. She takes her to every doctor, takes her to sanitariums, takes her to Saranac Lake, to Dr. Trudeau up there. She takes her to all the best experts. She can't save her daughter. And I found this letter in the Eleanor Roosevelt papers. This is a letter from Puss to Eleanor Roosevelt. Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, my nerve endings are raw with fatigue, and I think therefore that I have a vague idea of how some of our European brothers feel. This is after the war and all the refugees and everything. I don't mind not surviving, but I'm licked when it comes to this shadow world, and I'm not fit company for man or beast. Should things go well, you'll hear from me often. Should I disappear into thin air, I'll remember how much and how deeply I've loved and respected you and Mr. President. A heart full of love, Puss. Love to my dear aunt, and please don't talk me over with my mom. So, you know, there's a couple of letters that Puss writes to Eleanor Roosevelt, who she was very close with, that are just heartbreaking. She's facing death, and how she faces death in 1949 at the age of 46. The other thing that has been of enormous help in this research has been the Miriam Van Waters papers. Miriam Van Waters was an expert in criminology, juvenile delinquency, and prison reform. She was the superintendent at a women's reformatory in Massachusetts. She was a very well-known figure in corrections. She kept a diary her entire life, and the entire diary is up at the Harvard site. It has been absolutely essential for the research for this project. Mrs. Thompson met Miriam Van Waters in about 1927 at a corrections conference. They were both, Mrs. Thompson was running prisons here in New Jersey. Miriam Van Waters was a nationally recognized expert, and they became friends, and what historians now recognize as a love affair. That they have a 40-year relationship that is unmistakably romantic and unmistakably loving. The diaries describe her, she was at Brookdale constantly. She was constantly visiting Brookdale. Even in this entry in the diary, it says Thursday to Tuesday, April 20th, 1948. She goes to Brookdale, walk in woods. You know, so she talks all about what she does when she's at Brookdale and all the things. She and Mrs. Thompson visited each other almost every weekend, either one going to New Jersey or Mrs. Thompson going to Massachusetts. And the letters between them are extremely romantic and loving, and she had this very long relationship. So it's very complicated for a historian. Do we call Mrs. Thompson a lesbian? People say that to me, is Mrs. Thompson a lesbian? I said, well, you know, in their time, being a lesbian was a psychological diagnosis. It was in the DSM. It was considered a psychological illness to be a lesbian. They did not identify themselves as lesbians. Did they love each other? They were absolutely extremely dependent on each other emotionally and loved each other very deeply. So, what are we to make of this? I think that this is part of the reason why there has never been a biography of Mrs. Thompson. I think that nobody has tackled that question. Nobody in the family wanted it to come out. Betty Babcock, who I'm going to go kind of circle back to Betty. Betty Babcock wrote all those letters talking about the family and talking about stuff. She never once mentions Miriam Van Waters. When I went to the Miriam Van Waters papers, guess what's in there? Letters from Betty. Betty is very close with Miriam. Miriam is like a member of the family. She's traveling with them. She's the godmother to some of the grandchildren. I mean, she is a member of their family. But nobody talks about it. It was the secret. And it's, I think, the reason why there's been no book in the past, because I think the family did not want this revelation to be revealed. But now maybe we're beyond it, 2022. We can talk about these issues, right, without fear of, now I don't understand, 1950, could you talk about these things openly? Could they have been open about the relationship? Obviously, it would have been a catastrophe to their careers and the scandal beyond scandal. So we have to understand, Betty was protecting her mother. The other issue is her son Bill. Her son Bill was disabled. They had taken a trip to Switzerland in 1913, and he went out, he was about 15 years old at the time. He went out by himself and climbed a glacier. And he fell 150 feet down the side of the glacier. And he shattered his leg. And he laid on a ledge for almost 48 hours before he was discovered. And doctors in Europe wanted to amputate his leg. His parents said no, no amputation, and he underwent dozens of operations just to have his leg okay. But he walked with a walker, he walked with a disabled. So what did Mrs. Thompson do? She built a one-story house on Brookdale Farm, known as Dr. Thompson's house, it's still there, and it's a one-story house so that he doesn't have to go upstairs. So he also had served in the Air Force during World War I as a pilot, and he had a crash with that, and he injured again, so he was disabled from this. He did overcome this. He finished school, he went to Yale, he went to medical school, and he became a very successful doctor as an adult. But these are some of the things that the farm, right? Everybody comes back to this farm. The farm is the place where people come to recover, to restore, to relax. Miriam Van Borders called Brookdale in her diary, I went to Brookdale for the weekend. I had Brookdale magic. Everybody loves to go to relax, to restore, to feel better when you're sick. She had belvederes built in the back of the house, on the 3rd floor, big, big windows for Puss to come and sit in so that she could get the sunlight for her tuberculosis. The farm was the centerpiece of their lives. Eleanor Roosevelt, and I'm done. So Eleanor Roosevelt was a very close friend. Also, Roosevelt's Franklin home was about 8 miles away from Geraldine's home. They grew up together, and Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Roosevelt were very close friends. Even though they were in different political parties, they worked together on the same issues. When I read the papers, I recognized something very interesting, that Mrs. Thompson would ask Mrs. Roosevelt for help. She would come, she would help. Mrs. Roosevelt would ask Mrs. Thompson for help, and she would help her. It was very equal back and forth. Especially during the Depression, Mrs. Roosevelt would write letters to Mrs. Thompson saying, you know, I got this very sad letter, this family suffering in New Jersey, will you do something for them during the Depression? So they really relied on each other a great deal. And she came to the fundraisers at MTHS. And I had something else to read for that, but I don't have time. So the end, the unwelcome gift, which is what I call the end of the story. When Mrs. Thompson got into her 90s, she had 2 of her children died in the 40s, so she had 2 remaining children. But she was worried about who was going to take over the farm when she passed. And this was became a preoccupation, a real worry to her. And so what she had hoped was, she really had hoped that her son Louis Jr. would move to the farm. She always wanted a Thompson to have the farm. But Louis had cancer, and he and his wife moved to Georgia. And Betty's story is that Lou's wife really didn't want to live in Brookdale, she wanted to live in Georgia. But he couldn't tell his mother that. So remember, Mrs. Thompson doesn't give up. She's not going to just say, okay, Lou, it's all right. She's gonna back him into it. She's gonna force his hand. She ruled this family. She was the matriarch. So what she did was she took 200 acres of the farm and she gave it to Lou ahead of time. She goes, oh, this will be good for taxes, take this 200 acres. This is the part of the...
Attention library patrons, the library will be closing in 15 minutes. If you wish to check any items out, please proceed to the circulation desk as soon as possible. Cash registers are now closed, and we no longer accept fines payments. Bathrooms will close in 10 minutes. The library will be open tomorrow at 9 a.m.
So, she's trying to force him into taking this land. The part that she gave to Lou before, in the early 60s, was the part that is now Brookdale Community College. So she lops off 200 acres, she gives it to Lou Jr. She said, oh, it'll be good for taxes, you take this part. She's trying to force him to take it. In her will in 1963, she also made a provision for her grandson Peter, who was Puss's son, that if he would live on the farm, she would give him $40,000 to build a house. So she says, I'll give you, if you live here, you have to live on it. If you don't live on it, you lose the land. So she's trying to manipulate all of the people to get somebody, a Thompson, to have the land. And then there's the one. Monmouth County was growing very quickly in the 1950s. The Parkway had opened. There was a tremendous amount of influx of population, but there was not enough counties, parks, and there wasn't enough public space. And so she's approached by the freeholders, and she ultimately decides to give part of her land to the Monmouth County Park System for a playground and for children. She really loved doing things that involved children. It had to be a park. So at the end, her son Lou predeceased her by 2 years. And when she passed away, she ended up giving us the gift, right? Monmouth County's residents really got the great gift by her leaving that land undeveloped, not turned into a subdivision, to the Monmouth County residents with its buildings in exactly the way she left it. And what happened after Mrs. Thompson died, her daughter-in-law sold Lou's part to the county for Brookdale. And I think that even though Mrs. Thompson didn't get what she wanted, she didn't get a Thompson living there, I think she would be incredibly pleased that the land was preserved, that everyone enjoys it every day. People walk and bike and play and jog, and that the county has a wonderful college for its students to use for educational purposes. I think she would be very pleased that she lost that battle at the end. So I'm going to end it there. I want to give you a couple of minutes to ask a question or two. If anybody has any good Mrs. Thompson stories, I'm just loving that. I have my business cards there. If anybody wants my card, take one on the way out. If you know anybody who knew Mrs. Thompson or know anybody who has any, stories, please tell them to me. I love to hear Mrs. Thompson or Brookdale Farm stories. And does anybody have any questions?
In view of Geraldine's relationship with another woman and Louis's ardent letter and expression to Geraldine, do you think Geraldine rejected Lou?
No, I think she was really lucky. She had love coming from two different people. She loved two different people. I think she loved Lou. And hers. There are writings that she writes about Lou in very affectionate terms as well. I don't think she rejects Lou. She's,
I mean, is that why he spent so much time away from her?
I think it was health related. I do. I think it was partly his health, and I think it was partly his lifestyle. He was a very wealthy man. He enjoyed,
He's a big sportsman, but not into horses.
not well, he liked to go and watch polo and stuff, but he doesn't take up his father, he doesn't take up what his father leaves for him. He sells his father's horses and he leases the barns to Harry Whitney instead. Yes, Liz.
Do all the structures, the homes and stuff that they built, are they still there?
Some of them have burned down. I mean, they've had a lot of fires there. You could do a whole night on fires at Brookdale Farm. They've had tons and tons of fires. But the Dr. Thompson building is still there. The Preston house burned down, but there are a lot of, even the Withers stuff is still there. The Withers buildings, believe it or not, that's like 150 years ago.
Can you visit this?
Yeah, sure, they're there. If you walk, they have a wonderful walking tour of Thompson Park every month. On a Saturday, you can go and get a walking tour of the grounds, and I really encourage anybody who's interested to do that. It's a lovely walking tour of that. Yes?
I know a couple who lived in the Thompson farm. I was married in 1967, and the Bucks who were friends of my wife's parents. And they, when he was a young engineer working for Bell Labs, they had a small apartment upstairs on the third floor. And he used to tell me some stories about Mrs. Thompson. She was close to 80, in her 80s then.
Sure.
But some nice stories.
Yes, and I know.
And the gentleman was a young engineer just starting out with his wife, and he had a son, and then he later bought a home in Monmouth. But they lived there for over 2 years, I believe.
Yes, I know a couple also that lived there in the 50s. There was a real housing shortage after World War II and during World War II, and so she had turned a lot of the buildings into apartments. She housed people during World War II because there was a housing shortage, and then afterwards she rented the apartments. And Mary Lou Wagner and Leo Wagner, who Mary Lou taught with me at Brookdale when I was hired, and she lived here. That's that first time I knew anything about Mrs. Thompson was from Mary Lou Wagner.
Well, the name the folks were the Bucks.
The Bucks. Okay. Great. Did you have a question? Anybody else? Yes.
Half-truth and rumor emerge into the life story of every legendary figure, especially when newspaper reporters get involved. Have you found some examples that warp the generally accepted biography of Geraldine?
Newspaper stories about?
Half-truths and rumor that have come to the common knowledge, so to put it.
Lore.
That just aren't true.
Yeah. You know, there's a very, it seems to be kind of a very set of facts about her. That become very repetitive in all the newspaper stories you read about her. Now, she sort of starts to kind of disappear from the newspapers in the 60s. When she gets into her 90s, the newspapers aren't covering her. She's not really, running meetings and things as much as she was when she was younger. Half-truths, I don't know. I guess she was very private. I think she didn't want us to know her. She's very private. She doesn't, it's the times also. Nobody wants anybody to know their private business about who's sick and, who got speeding tickets. And there were a bunch of scandals that racked the family. Car accidents, things like that. But I can't think of anything that really kind of, the newspapers are pretty, they pretty much follow the same script about her, and they're boring. When you start reading them over and over, and you're like, all right, I know what you're gonna say next. They kind of get boring.
It's wonderful now that Brookdale, the children of Monmouth County, boys and girls play. It's known for their soccer fields and their sports. It's quite, and yet, a lot of kids now really know Brookdale.
Yeah. It's really, it was an unwelcome gift to her kids. No one wanted it. No one wanted to live there. But it really has given so much to Monmouth County. And we were mentioning this earlier, that when when she donated the land, she was the first big donation that they ever got to the Monmouth County Park System. And so the other widows in Monmouth County saw what she did, and they also donated their farms. So that's why we have Hartshorn Woods. That's why we have, Wallingford Farm, and some of the other widows saw, she always was blazing the trail, right? She's always blazing the trail for other people. And so she made an enormous impact. And there's a great book on